tonight. Welcome to Startup UCLA. Startup UCLA is a program focused on connecting UCLA students, alumni, and the LA community together around entrepreneurship and specifically around software technology and entrepreneurship. And we'd like to thank our sponsors, Lightspeed Ventures, as well as Manat. And tonight we're really excited to welcome Eric Wu, who's going to be doing a talk around SEO. Eric has an incredible background that spans multiple companies here in LA, some of the biggest names, and has been involved in an array of interesting projects, and we're really excited to have him here tonight. So with that, if we could give a warm welcome to Eric.
Thank you, Robert. So this meeting is going to be a little bit, or the presentation is going to be a little bit ad hoc, and definitely throw out questions as I go along. I know that you guys have a diverse background on the products that you are working on, as well as your own technical backgrounds. I've got two presentations which I can jump into, and then even if we want to get a little bit nerdier, we can get into something really, really technical. My background is I've kind of done marketing, product engineering, business intelligence, all of that through my career. Currently I'm at Edmunds.com. If you're not familiar with that, that's a car research company where you can find everything from pricing to anything about your car. Prior to that, I was at Spin Media, where I headed up the product, business intelligence, and engineering teams for like Spin Magazine, Vibe Magazine, entertainment, music. And then prior to that, I was at Demand Media, where I led the SEO team for eHow, where we were doing 130 million uniques a month, which at that time we were a ComScore 8 site, so we were just behind eBay. And then prior to that, I was at AT&T, REALTOR, and a bunch of other places. I like different companies. So this is a presentation that I typically will give to other startups and accelerator groups. And although it's somewhat high level, there are some tactical things. And so again, stop me if there's stuff that you want clarity on, or you want to voice your opinion or something like that. So let's get started. That's me on the internet. Those are some of the places I worked at. So we're going to be talking about crawlability, accessibility, usability, searchability, engageability. This is kind of like the things that you really need to take care of, the core that you need to take care of. And if you take care of this, you don't have to worry about all the other SEO BS that's out there, from I need to do link building to I need to put these keywords on my website and stuff like that. As long as you take care of some of these things, like, you'll be able to achieve the SEO goals that you'll need in the short run, or even in the long term. So crawlability is about making your site easy for bots. So especially now in today's world, everything is moving toward Ajax, JavaScript, and there's a lot of power there. At the same time, although Google's been making strides to crawl JavaScript, you still need to give them a flat HTML static view for them to actually crawl and ingest. So I'll talk a little bit more about this, but that's really the key of making your site perfectly great from an SEO perspective, is that you need to make sure that Google can understand what your site is about. So the first thing that you need to take care of, URLs. URLs are like diamonds, so they are forever. If you want to change your URLs, it's a large pain in the butt. So when you're thinking about URLs, make sure that you plan to make them clean. So by clean, you want to make sure that you put your keywords in there, but for the most part, you want to avoid query parameters. Although Google understands what query parameters are, they have to machine learn into figuring out what changes the page and what doesn't change the page. So really here, in short, is that if you can start off in a good spot where you don't have all these different query parameters, you won't have any additional headaches in the future. So to kind of push this thought through is that, let me skip over one slide, is this idea of a canonical. So if you're not familiar with this, there's a tag that you can put on your website or on your web page that basically says, this is the one and only URL that you should reference this page by. So in the case if you have a query parameter, say like your Wikipedia, and you want to, say, filter something, or you want to add tracking parameters, you would put a query parameter and attach a long string at the end. This is a way to tell Google that all those query parameters all consolidate to this place. So in a simpler term, each URL is unique to Google, right? So even though the content is the same, they see all these different URLs to be unique, right? So what canonicalization is doing here is, say you go to the store and you want to buy a piece of candy and it's $3, right? If you don't do canonicals, essentially you can have different URLs and each dollar would represent a URL. You would have a dollar bill in the bank, you would have a dollar bill in your wallet, and you would have a dollar bill sitting on the coffee table at home. When you're at the store, you don't have $3. You effectively have $3, but you don't have $3 at the time where you want to make the transaction. What canonicalization does is it allows you to group all those dollar bills into your one wallet so that when you go make that transaction, that you have it available. So in the SEO terms of things is that Google's going to see all these links that are coming across the web to your site. And they're going to do their best to cluster these types of URLs into bigger chunks. And essentially, you want to consolidate all those chunks into one big piece so that you can retain all the value possible. So making sure you have this on your page is extremely important. Going back to talk about JavaScript, I can get into this a little bit more depending on how much JavaScript each of the sites are using. But I get the sense that only a handful of the sites are going to be using a lot of heavy AJAX. But the thing to note here is that if you're going to use AJAX, avoid the Google AJAX crawling specification, which they kind of put out there. But the last time they revised this was 2009 or something like that. So avoid that. If you want to see a good example of it, you can actually go to Quartz. And I actually can jump into this real quick just to give you a sense of what JavaScript push state is and how it can potentially benefit you in the SEO front. So Quartz is kind of this newfangled new hotness in the publishing space. They're a sub company of Atlantic Media, which is a larger media corporation. And they have this idea of every single page is the home page, or every single page should behave like the home page. So as I scroll down here, I don't know if you can see this, but once I get into an article here, the URL up here is going to actively change as I scroll. So they have this concept of infinite scroll, and as I get into another story, the URL continues to change. I don't know if you're seeing that. It's a little bit hard, a little bit small. But essentially, from this point, they're using JavaScript push state to change that URL. So in the case where a person is going to be sharing a URL, I can actually open up another tab, share this URL with my friend, and get directly to that piece of content. And then from here, I can scroll and get into the next article yet again. So they're doing a couple things here where, although this is great from an SEO perspective, they have a nice clean URL. They're using push state to change the URL, so it's a nice shareable URL. But also from a user experience standpoint, this is one of the things that if you find yourself using your iPhone and your iPad a lot to read content, you'll notice that the easiest interaction for you is to scroll. I don't have to click. I don't need to, hover, press anything. It's just scrolling, right? I can continue to consume more content. So from a mobile perspective, this is something that will give you positive SEO value, which I'll kind of go into, where user experience actually plays into how SEO actually ranks your site, or how Google will actually rank your site. Accessibility, if you're familiar with this, is basically trying to make the site available to everyone and everything. So Googlebot is the main crawler for Google, and essentially it's a machine, it's a server, it's a box, right? And it can't actually see your web page. And just like site disabled or site impaired users can't see your website, marking up your HTML in a semantic way, or that gives additional data to the screen reader will actually be great for Googlebot because they can understand different sections of your site. So the important thing here is, from SEO perspective, the title tag is where you really want to spend a good amount of your time to figure out what content you want to put in there, because that's what Google's really triggering on the context of the page. Using H1s through H6s, this is kind of proper HTML5. This is basically, it's a standard now, but you can imagine if you can replace any of these tags with spans or divs or anything along those lines, and by adding these additional, by using these additional semantic tags, Google will understand better what your site is about. With images, one thing to note there is that although you can have text and images, and Google has a technology to OCR these things, they're largely not going to. They're going to actually be using the alt text as the key for what that image is about. HTML5 and linked data. If you have data that is very structured, meaning like at Edmunds, we have cars, and cars have certain makes, certain models, certain trims, certain specifications on the wheels. Schema.org is the place where Google and a bunch of other search engines have gotten together and said, we're going to allow you to mark up your content so we know specifically what it's about. One way to illustrate this is if I search for like Barack Obama. So Google here is taking semantic data. So in engineering terms, right, the word Barack Obama or the text Barack Obama doesn't really mean anything, right? We know it as a person, but an engine or a machine doesn't know it as an actual person. It just knows that Barack Obama is a thing, right? Or it's just a string of text. By using semantic data or something like schema.org, you can actually say Barack is his first name, Obama is his last name. You can also do things where they know when he's born, his age, they know who his spouse is, and they also know his siblings, and then, of course, they know other people that people are looking at, like Putin, Bush, and all these other people. The interesting thing here is that although Google is using, so in my case for cars, right, if I looked at like the Honda Accord MPG, Google is starting to do these things where this is called an answer box. They are starting to pull in data from different sources and displaying it directly to the user, because they know that it's a better user experience than having to drive the user to your website. But if you can be the source of this, you know, this is actually another Google search, but if you can be the source of this data, you'll be viewed as a site worthy of ranking for Google. So although you're giving up some of your potential click through because you're essentially giving this up to a Google search result, Google will actually find more value. And so like in this case, the fueleconomy.gov ranks in both the first and second position. So jumping back in. The other thing to know about this is that you probably don't want to do this optimization unless you're at that point where you've done a lot of the other basic SEO stuff. But this could basically propel you from position 3 to position 1 if done right. And as far as traffic, that's actually pretty significant, because from an SEO perspective, the click-through rate by position drops off exponentially. So the first position click-through, in general, will receive a 50 to 60% click-through. The second position, 40%. Third position, 20, 25%. And it'll drop all the way down to like 1 or 2%. And then surprisingly, or not surprisingly, position 10 actually has a higher click-through rate than 9 because it's the last one. But moving from position 3 to position 1 could be 3 times more traffic than you might be expecting. And with schema.org, it's one of these things where SEO is kind of like a bear race. If a bear is chasing all of us, I don't need to be faster than the bear. I just need to be faster than you. So if I'm just slightly better than you, I'm going to win. When you're thinking about mobile web, think responsive. There's definitely a lot of strategies around here, whether or not you have a separate code base or you have actual responsive site. What is more complicated, what is easier? From a SEO, pure SEO perspective, you want to be a responsive web, because if you have a separate code base, you need to indicate to Google that your site changes based on the user agent and not based on the screen width, right? So that in that case, when you signal to Google that, hey, you need to change your user agent, they'll actually use a different user agent. Now, Google has something like 30, 50,000 boxes, something larger than that, that actually crawls the web using Googlebot. And Googlebot proper, the one that crawls everything, uses a lot of their resources. The mobile version actually only is a small set of their servers. So if you want them to comprehensively crawl your entire mobile website, you're better off being responsive because you'll have that scale of the larger Googlebot. Hopefully that makes sense. Ultimately, if anything you're left with is that usability is really the key to having a really great SEO, to really gain in SEO. So thinking about links on your site, usually people will say, okay, I'm going to put links at the bottom, put like more links here so that I can pass more Google juice. So if you understand how PageRank works, the original idea of PageRank is that each link is a vote, and more links that you get to a location, the more votes you're getting to a location. And in a single page, you are dividing up your vote among every single link. So you can manipulate the search engine if you're thinking about the traditional PageRank. That no longer stands true. And so if you ever deal with SEO, one of the things that you should think about is where users are actually clicking. So this is like a typical website, and you'll see bad SEO or insane SEO links at the bottom. And this is typical, right? Like underneath the privacy policy and the copyright, you'll see a bunch of links. And people are like, oh, that's how they do well in SEO. That's how they used to do well in SEO. And funny enough, my old boss at Demand Media, she actually popularized this at IAC City Search. She was basically the cause for all these links that you see here. Search engines have this idea of page segmentation, and they can clearly divide up your page now. And what they do is they look at, okay, where's the logo? And where is the navigation where we see all the time? So those links that are in the navigation, we'll give it a certain weight. It's important because it's at the top of the page, but at the same time, we're not giving it a huge amount of weight for this particular page because that stuff in the global navigation may not necessarily directly relate to the content that's on this page. And then they'll look at your code and they'll say, oh, these links that are near the copyright symbol, those are probably at the bottom of the page. Most users are probably never going to click on these things. And then what you get all the value is all the links in the middle. So if you think about how PageRank works, and if you kind of know a little bit of how PageRank works, you can kind of think of they're adding weighted values, meaning they're multiplying the links that are happening in the middle more than they would actually multiply any of these links as far as passing like a vote or value. So one of these links might be 1 vote, and a link in here might be 100 votes. I wanted to say something else, but I lost it. So another thing that you'll read, and this is part of this talk, is really you're going to go out and you're going to read up on SEO, and there's a lot of myths out there, and I just want to make sure that what you're reading is actually true, because there's always someone says this and someone says the exact opposite. So you'll see this thing where people are saying, oh, you should reduce bounce rate, you should reduce bounce rate, or you should reduce bounce rate, which is a great thing from user experience. But really what you're trying to do is reduce search refinements. So just to illustrate this, if I'm looking for, like, I'll use cars, right? So if I'm looking to buy a Honda Accord, I might say something like, or say like a Ford Explorer, right? So I might say Explorer. And I got Windows Explorer, Internet Explorer, more Microsoft. Oh, here's the stuff I want. But most users actually don't get down that far. The next thing they're going to do is, if, say, like for instance, they clicked on this, they'll look at this, oh, clearly not Ford Explorer. Let me go back. Let me type in Ford Explorer. Oh, okay, that looks like more what I'm looking for. Click on this result. This looks what I want, but it doesn't have exactly what I'm looking for. So then I'll go back and maybe click on the next listing. Well, this is the Wikipedia article. I want to actually buy something. And then I might actually, say like Ford Explorer 2014. So what I'm actually doing is kind of typical search behavior, but these are all what we call search refinements. So in the case of Wikipedia, right, I clicked, I left, I bounced. Effectively, I bounced. And you could say, okay, that's a bad user experience. But if I'm looking for something like, how to tie a tie, and I click here, and I learned how to tie a tie, like, no problem, right? And essentially, I effectively bounce. It actually addressed my answer. And then now I'm not searching for how to tie a tie. I'm going to search for renting a tux, right? Google's tracking all these things, right? Google's tracking to see whether or not if the user is getting to your site and you're addressing their needs, if you're actually satisfying what their task is. And they're using all this user feedback to see whether or not they should rank you higher or not. So in the cases where I was continually doing search refinements, Google's going to go back and say, should we really put Internet Explorer at the top for the word Explorer based on everybody on the web searching for Explorer or everybody in my region searching for Explorer? If the large majority of the people are going to be clicking on an Explorer, downloading an Explorer, then Explorer is the correct term or the correct thing to rank for the word Explorer. And you can kind of see this. If you search for eagle or eagles, Google's not sure what you're looking for. So right now, I'm getting news for the NFL. And then the next thing will be the band, and then NFL, and then the band again. But if I go down, you can actually get images for actual eagles if you're doing a book report or something like that. The thing is, Google's not sure what to show here. And in this case, because there's something relevant that happened, they think, okay, maybe you're looking for the NFL stuff. So the point really is, if you can figure out a better user experience to actually solve the user's need and prevent them from doing a search refinement instead of just bouncing, then you're actually going to see yourself improve in organic search. So this is one of the things that we actually did at Demand Media, actually. If you go to eHow, and pardon me as I stumble over this site because I don't know how to navigate it anymore. That's the blog. Okay, so one of the things that we did is to not necessarily trick the search engine, but what we noticed were Google is a statistical machine. So it does machine learning. And if you're familiar with machine learning, is that it's trying to figure out, do the words that the user's putting into the search engine and the location that we're sending them to, does that satisfy the user's intent? And the thing about search is that this metric is a little bit old, but I think it still stands true, is that 20% of the searches that they see every month are searches or terms that they've never seen in the history of Google. So that means there's a large percentage of the web that is just continually growing, and there's topics about it, but they're completely new topics every single month. So Google's not sure, if say Crocs is not a thing yet, right? And people are searching for Crocs. They're like, what the hell are Crocs, right? So we'll just start auditioning web pages. And this is part of the machine learning. They'll throw a web page up. They'll see, did the user click? Did the user do a search refinement? Or were they on to the next topic? If they were on to the next topic, then, oh, that would probably be a great result. So we started noticing these things in our search logs, and that Google was sending traffic to us for terms that were a little bit off, right? In this case, it would be something about nectarines, right? And then we would get search terms around peaches, or something that seemed related, but not quite answering the question when the user got here. And what we started doing is, so you can see here, they're relating to cauliflower, or they'll see things like hair. And what we started doing is we actually started taking those terms that we're seeing coming in that were not necessarily relevant, putting them into our own search, and finding articles that we could surface up to the user. So if they came in on this page and they're looking for cauliflower, they started scrolling like, oh, this is not about cauliflower. And they saw this link here and they clicked on it. Oh, okay, this is what I'm looking for. And we answered their need. They no longer went back to Google and did a search refinement. And for this, we actually saw a tremendous lift in organic search traffic. Because what would happen is this article here would rank a little bit for cauliflower. And then when, they're doing their own machine learning, so they've reordered the results. But we would see that once we linked over and the users were satisfying their need, this page that we had about cauliflower would come from page 5 and start making its way up to page 1 and start ranking really well for page 1. Because we were now satisfying the user's need for that query. And also, over time, as Google understood our page, they're like, oh, there's a better page on your site about cauliflower, and you're clearly linking to that already. So we're going to surface that up to the user. So we saw double-digit growth on this.
I'm curious how you guys measure the impact on stuff. We had a really hard time with this when I was working at Etsy, is actually trying to sort of tie the projects that we were doing to try to improve our SEO with actual results. There's sort of there's a lot of measuring tools you can use. I'm just kind of curious.
So demand media was a little bit different than any other site. The thing to know about demand media is that for each article that we published, it was published within a given month, and we would cohort that month. So meaning all articles that were published in January of 2014 were one cohort, and all articles that were published in February of 2014 were a second cohort. And we actually tracked the traffic patterns over time, and they were consistent. After 1 month of being on the site, they would get 5 pages per visit per day. After 2 months, they would get 10. After 3, they would get 15. And so we knew that we had this steady growth. So we knew that anything within that month should have that steady growth. So what we did was we took a given month and we split it for the test, right? So at that point, we know, because with SEO, you can't do traditional A/B testing because Google's not going to see those JavaScript things that you're changing. So you need to find 2 sample sets of URLs on your site that behave in the same manner, and you change one and you leave the other as your control. And then you repeat the task to see if you can repeat it, then that means you might have something, right? And that's basically how we discovered that. So we would do something like just change the title for this set and don't change the title for this set. Change the meta description for this set, don't change it for this set. And then we would see, okay, incremental lift, is it just seasonality, is it just chance? Do it again. After you do it again, then you kind of say, oh, this seems to be sticking, and then try it in a larger sample. How long would you wait? So it depends. For demand media, it was probably a week-long test, which was extremely fast. But this is where this concept where, I don't know if I have it in my deck, but basically your crawl rate is one of the most important metrics that you should be looking at. And a lot of people actually don't look at this. And even in the SEO community, you're not going to read about this. But basically, crawl rate in Google Webmaster Tools is a barometer for how much Google actually trusts your site. they have so much bandwidth, they only have so much time in which they can allocate to your site. For sites that are very important, they're going to crawl repeatedly. For sites that are not so important, they're like, oh, we'll come back in a week to see if anything's changed. So to have a healthy crawl rate, it should be about 80% to 100% of your size, the size of your site. So if you have a 100-page site, you should see 80 to 100 URLs crawled per day in Google Webmaster Tools. If you're far below that, that means Google doesn't really trust you. If you're far above that, that means Google loves you. And so at Demand Media, we did a bunch of these optimizations from both speed as well as, and I can show you a different deck, but as well as speed as well as usability. And what ended up happening was our crawl rate on eHow, we had like a 3 million article corpus, right? 3 million articles that we cared about. Our crawl rate was 15 million per day, meaning Google was coming back and crawling our site 5 times over every single day. And we had evergreen content. This content does not change. So why are they here crawling it so often? They're looking for comments. They're also looking for how our links were changing. But we had such strong signals that they thought that we were such an important site that they needed to measure every single change. And because of that, whenever we publish an article, we were publishing anywhere from like 500 to 5,000 articles per day. And we would get them crawled within a few hours and indexed that same day. And we were receiving traffic that same day. So when you think about long tail, which is where our strategy was, being able to capture users immediately in that long tail was extremely important. And when you think about strategy yourself, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, is that when you're going after the long tail, it's a lot easier because instead of having to compete with hundreds of sites, you're really only competing with like 5 or 6 people. And even if you're in the top 5 results, you're going to get decent amount of traffic, right? So early on, a long tail strategy is actually a pretty good one.
So that's one of the strategies that we were trying to use is to exact match on certain long tail searches.
Right.
You know, like not just best baby stroller, but to match on best car seat compatible baby stroller rated for 40 pounds.
Right.
Right. And then we would match on that.
Right.
But what we found is in this current incarnation that that's something that's we're not getting any mileage out of that, like 0, because of authority. So
Right.
Whether you want to address it now or just at some point.
No, totally. So
And is, when you're starting at 0, when you're like, hello world,
Right.
This, what are the best, fastest, most powerful ways to build the trust that will allow us to then later leverage our exact match?
So there's a couple things in there, right? But long tail strategy is long term, right? You're not going to get it in the next 3 to 6 months. Like I said, it's even for Demand Media where we had a huge amount of trust, the first month you're talking about only like 5 page views per article per day or even per month, right? It's small, it's minuscule, but at scale, it's a lot. It's 130 million uniques, right? Part of building that trust early on, there's 2 ways to do it, right? So either you're a social media sensation, which I'll go into, or you basically build up a long enough, track record that you're consistently good over a period of a year, 2 years, 3 years even before Google will say, okay, like they'll send you traffic along the way, but you'll see at some point you'll hockey stick over the other guys as long as you have compelling information. But I'll go over it a little bit.
Is that traffic as you're building trust? Because like right now we have 0 trust. So how do you get the initial?
So getting the initial trust is largely not an SEO thing. So it's going to be largely social. It's largely around, are people talking to you about you? Are people linking to you? Are people citing you in different places? Are you actually a reliable resource? And I'll go into that.
Okay, so the backlink building from people that already have the trust.
Correct,
Okay.
correct. I'll breeze through some of this other stuff. So sending users to other quality sites, I'll actually go over this as well in a different presentation. Searchability. So I know some of the things is people get hung up on keyword phrases. This is an old picture, but Google Trends is actually a great place to look for what words that you should actually stick in your URL or stick in your title, and it actually can discover new things that you may not have considered. So this was for mom assembly in the Mucker Accelerator group, and they basically are trying to help moms learn about how to be a mom, right? Because a lot of moms like, I don't know how to be a mom. I don't want to be a bad mom. So they need to learn about these things. And what was cool was that we started with like sleep training and cry it out, right? Those are two kind of concepts that people are very familiar with. And then as we looked at the trending terms, the related terms that Google had surfaced, we also discovered this thing called Ferber method and like Weisbluth sleep method. And they actually, you can see that they're actually picking up in Steam. And one of the cool things in Google Trends is that you can actually be pretty fine-tuned in what you're looking for. So if I go to Google Trends, so one of the things today, I was talking to my coworker and I was like, okay, car inventory, like actual cars for sale. What's more popular, inventory or the word VIN, right? And we're like, oh, inventory should be more popular because it's a more common term. No one's going to really be searching for VIN. And here, VIN is more. But at the same time, inventory is a broad term. So you can actually do these cool things. Maybe it's hard to see, but let me see if I can blow this up. But you can actually filter by region, and you can also filter by date, which I largely don't do. But you can also filter by your vertical. So if the word inventory could possibly cross multiple categories, this will give you a more clean look at what your actual category might be looking for. And a great thing about Google Trends is, one, they can give you forecasting on important topics, which means if they can give you forecasting, that means there's a consistent trend year over year, which also can help you with your PR efforts or your content creation efforts. Because now you'll know that a spike happens in, here in July. So that means I need to start planning maybe in March ahead of time, right? Or when it's down season in November, December, this is where I really need to do all my planning and get things started so I'm ready for that peak season. Keyword tools, there's a bunch of them out there that are all right or wrong. As long as you're using the same keyword tool and you're using them as a relative gauge, not as an actual gauge, that's where, don't get hung up on, someone, like some tool saying, oh, you should be getting 1 million impressions for this. They're all wrong. They're all wrong by large magnitudes, depending on what keyword phrase you're looking at. Even the Google keyword tool. Engageability, I'll actually kind of breeze through this stuff. Like obviously Facebook comments, and one thing to talk about Google Plus is that it used to be pretty relevant, and it can still drive a decent amount of traffic, but I would hedge a little bit nowadays given that they're kind of taking a step away from the Google Plus community. But in the past, this is one of the ways to actually search or get rankings for head terms. So what we were doing at Spin Media was Google was looking for so there's a bunch of things when you put on your tinfoil hat, right? Why did Google create Gtalk? Why did Google create Gmail? And why did Google create Google Plus? It's because they knew that there's content and links that are flowing through email that they couldn't see. There's content and links that are flowing through IM that they can't see. And there's content and links that basically Google or Facebook and Twitter pushed them out of, right? And they wanted to see that stuff because they knew that it's a different type of medium where people were communicating. And it still works today where you can actually change a person's search results for very popular head terms where you would think that you probably couldn't rank. So this is one of the things that we did at Slowbuzz. If I'm still following them. So let's see if this works. There it is. So for this head term, right, Cara Delevingne, I have no idea who that is. Google will tell me she's an English fashion model. This is an extremely hard term to rank for. And we would do this for Jay-Z, for Beyonce, for single word terms. And although we're not ranking number 1, we're ranking number 5, right? And this is extremely powerful because these terms receive millions upon millions of searches, right? As opposed to going after the long tail where you're only seeing 5 or 10 pages. Ranking in this position can be thousands to 10,000s or even hundreds of thousands of incoming traffic. The caveat here is that it only will surface to users who are following you on Google+. So we spent a lot of effort to raise our Google+ numbers to 1 million followers. So for those 1 million followers who know our brand, who are actively following us, we actually change their search results. And this is where SEO goes into, like when you're thinking about like the lean startup methodology, right? You're thinking acquisition, retention, and this is largely retention. This is not just pure acquisition. I'm not getting new users. I'm now surfacing myself up to those users who may have known my brand, who may have actually even just forgot about me, and now I'm in their face again. And if I can convert that user who may have just like said, oh, this is kind of cool, I'll just follow it, into a loyal user who now comes in directly, that is a powerful thing. Because once you are a strong brand, you can do all kinds of things from an SEO perspective, and Google's not going to penalize you. So one of the examples of this is BMW. BMW Germany, they've been penalized twice. And they've been penalized by Google because they did like the most horrendous Google penalty is cloaking, right? Basically, they were serving Googlebot one thing, and they're serving users a whole nother thing. And they initially did it because they had a Flash site, and Google couldn't crawl it. So they're like, okay, we'll create a Google-only version, and we'll stuff it with all these keyword phrases. And Google said, hey, we don't like this. And they were outed because one of their competitors like, hey, those guys are doing stuff that you don't like. And so Google had to penalize them. They took them out of the search results. But at the same time, Google had to actively help BMW fix their problem. Because if you're a user and you're searching for BMW and the BMW website doesn't come up, you're not going to say, oh, bad on you, BMW, for cloaking and doing the bad SEO thing. No, you have no clue. You're going to say, wow, Google really sucks. They can't even bring up the BMW homepage, right? So if you're in a power position, like your Amazon, your eBay, your Wikipedia, you're one of these things where people expect you to be there, just like TripAdvisor. People expect it to be there. If it disappears overnight, they're like, what the hell, Google? They're not saying what the hell to the business. So if you can establish yourself as a strong brand, even in your niche, that's where you're going to get all that power. Query deserves freshness. So I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in depth, but this is where you can unseat your competitors at for very strong head terms. Building links by building buzz. So this is one of those things where, again, I'll go into a different deck, but you'll hear a lot about link building. And the thing is, it's not about, you don't want to build links just paying people and getting links that way. That's very unnatural, and also you're going to get penalized very quickly. The better way of doing it is building it by just building PR, straight social buzz, right? And I know I've been going for a long time, so you guys, if you need to stop or whatever, let me know. But I'm going to go into this other deck where I'll talk about how social and SEO kind of interplay and how you can actually get a lot of benefit just by doing PR and social along with SEO. So questions so far before I drone on? Okay, let's go over this real quick. Okay, so this is what I was doing at Spin Media, and when I got there, they were like, oh, we don't need SEO. We're good. We do social. We're a social company. 60-70% of our traffic is SEO, is social. SEO is small. Like, no one really cares, right? So this is actual traffic data, right? So the green line that you'll see throughout this presentation, that's referral traffic. That's essentially social, right? The non-paid pink that's the SEO traffic, and the purple is the direct traffic. So
Is the purple paid?
no. Purple is direct, okay. Meaning not paid. So we didn't actually do any paid traffic. So social, it's like grand opening. You get a flood of traffic, and this is typical of what you see, right? Huge spike of traffic, and then it just dissipates, right? Because no one's like, oh, I don't really care about over time. Apologize for the content material. This is what we dealt with all day long. But referrals was 5 times more than search and 10 times more than direct, right? So this is why like social was the thing for us. We knew that if we just kept on driving social, it's a lot of traffic. Same with this, like 4 times more than search, 17 times more than direct, and then we re-promoted it at another time. So this time period is over a few months. So it got picked up again in social and got another huge spike. The thing is, if you spend time on your SEO, you can actually do 3x more than social will do over a 9-month period. And that's why SEO is a long-term thing. And it also converts users to direct users. This is where you can actually build your brand and get off the reliance of Google, get off the reliance of Facebook and all these other traffic metrics. And people can come directly to you. So here is a case where we had a slideshow gallery about celebrities without makeup. We did that social promotion, huge spike that we normally see, right? We got some SEO spike, we got some direct spike. But as we applied the SEO best practices to this, and it got picked up again in social, like another social network, over time what happens is you'll get more organic search traffic. And the thing is, what's going on here is this idea of query deserves freshness. So it's unfortunate where this algorithm came from, but back when 9/11 happened, people were searching for Twin Towers, people were searching for New York, seeing what happened. Google didn't have an algorithm here. They actually had to put at the bottom of all their search results links to CNN, links to New York Times, links to all the media publications. And soon after that, they decided, we need something that is a real-time search changer. And they decided this thing called query deserves freshness, meaning like if a new query happens or something of note happens where we're seeing a velocity of queries for a thing, that means something has changed and we need to surface up something different. So think about, we're in LA, think about earthquakes, right? When you search for earthquakes today, no earthquake happened, you'll get like the national whatever thing of earthquakes, right? You won't see any news about it. You'll just get standard Wikipedia, what is an earthquake? When an earthquake actually happens, Google search results change, right? They put the news thing at the top, they put any kind of relevant blogger or any kind of relevant information, and it'll change the search results. At that time, those search results are malleable, meaning that's your time to be able to inject yourself and get a new seeding, right? So in the cases of like you're not going to create earthquakes, but for your own product, right? You know that when your product launches, if you get coverage, especially like coming from an accelerator, you're going to get PR, right? And you're going to get people talking to you. And if you know that someone's going to do an article about you, like from TechCrunch, Mashable, any kind of major publication, even Eurospace, and you know kind of roughly where that time frame is, you should plan accordingly. So before you know that date happens, what you want to do is you want to make sure that afterwards people continually talk about you. So if you look at this chart, right, social thing happens, another social thing, and if people continue to talk about you over time, Google's going to give you more rankings, right? Here's another example, where when we launched the first time, this is actually a huge social spike. I mean, it's eclipsed by this stuff. But what's happening is, over time, as people continue to talk about us, our organic search keeps on going up. And what's happening is, Google sees that this disruption, this earthquake that's happened, it's happening every single day after or every single week after. It's not just a fad, it's a trend that they need to keep ahead of and that they need to continue to rank for your site. So if you actually have a quality product and you want to give yourself the best opportunity, what you want to do is take advantage of this query deserves freshness, which means in practical terms, if you know that you have a big publication that's going to come out, you should reach out to bloggers, other people who have websites that can talk about you, and do your standard PR thing. You tell them, look, I'll give you beta access, I'll give you insight, interviews, but you cannot publish before this date. You have an embargo date, right? And you can even put that embargo date maybe like a day or 2 days after, right? And you line up these people, right? So TechCrunch hits, you get a spike, people start searching for your stuff, searching for your brand, what are you about? And then the next day, your blogger network or your network of people that you already have contact with, they start talking about you too. Their audience starts searching for you and looking for you. And as long as you have a sustainable product, other people will start talking about you, and you'll see that you'll start ranking better and better for those head terms, because they don't necessarily need to link to you for those head terms. And this is one of those things where it's a PR trick, right? So when you talk to these people that you want to give beta access to, you seed them with the words that you really are trying to go competitively after, right? If if you're doing something local, and like especially in the restaurant space, right? You can tell them this is your beta access to our new booking tool or new reservation tool, and emphasize those things that you want them to write about. You don't necessarily tell them, hey, make sure you link to us with these words, but as long as you're kind of giving them that mindset to start with, why they should be talking about you, you'll start ranking better for those terms in that competitive space where you may not have thought that you had the chance to beat out your competitors. And you need to wait for that potential earthquake to happen to really give yourself the best footing.
I'm kind of curious with that. So say you have, there's a bunch of big publications. A lot of times they all want to be like exclusive, right? So you can go, are you saying like go to the one big one and then go to a bunch of smaller ones where you have more of the power in that?
Essentially. Yeah, and then just line them up so that it happens over time. And then if you have a lasting product, people are naturally going to talk about you even more.
So it's better to have like one big, but then like a sustained amount of story.
Right.
People, like if they're big also and they don't get the first big story.
Exactly. Or it might be something where you give them a different twist, right? And this is where the PR thing comes in. Like if you're giving them behind the scenes like access and it's an interview, maybe the other person you talk to is like, hey, we'll give you a video tour, right? Or we'll give you like the next feature after this step, right? And allow them to continue to talk about you. May not be exactly the thing that broke in the news, but people are going to constantly talk about your new ideas. So really what it boils down to is today, this is what we were getting. We're getting the social spike. We're getting SEO and direct. But in the end, if we do SEO right, the powerful thing here is, yes, I'm getting a lot of organic search traffic, but the really powerful thing is this direct is now rivaling what we were getting from social. And the thing is, the difference is that when you're thinking about social, right, think about your own behavior. I'm on Facebook, scrolling. Oh, that's funny. Click. Oh, that's cool. Go back. Like, I didn't even know what site I was on that I was reading, right? Like stuff like Buzzworthy and Upworthy and BuzzFeed, like it wasn't until years that people recognized the brands that were coming in their Facebook feed, right? It's because it was just they weren't in the mindset of actually having a task. When you're doing search, you have a specific task in mind, right? And those users are more likely to convert into direct users because they're on your site, they had a task in mind, you answered their task, they're like, oh, this is actually a pretty good site. I'm going to bookmark it, or I'm going to remember it for next time, and they're going to come back directly. Right? And those direct users are the people who are going to convert into your powerful users who will then reach out to your brand messages, and then hopefully you'll be at that point where you're the Amazon, you're the Wikipedia, you're the whatever, where Google can't deny your presence. I'll share all these decks with you guys too, so I'll send them to Robert so you can distribute to you guys. But these are basically editorial best practices that we gave our editorial team. So I won't necessarily dive into these things, but these are more just like tactical things that you can implement. One thing, I know none of you guys are publishers, so it doesn't really matter so much, but this is one of the things where we took advantage of the Google algorithm, and this is where you need to understand like, different parts of that search result are not one team who's building it, right? So what we started seeing was our editorial team, they kept on saying, this is stupid. We're writing SEO titles, right? We're writing SEO headlines where it's so obvious, and they wanted to be creative, and we gave them an outlet to be creative. So If you get to this point where you're like, I want to be a little bit more creative, especially with like the meme thing, right? But you still want to be descriptive to Google. This is one thing that you can do. So we had this concept of a headline and a deck. And if you're familiar with, I don't know if I can find an example, but sorry for the content again. OK. So in publishing terms, right, this is the headline, and then this is the deck, right? And it's subtle, but what we did was we made sure that the deck is the SEO thing, and the headline was the creative playground for the editorial team. And what we noticed in the Google search results was, well, actually, anyhow, what we noticed in the Google search results was that the news results, so if I search for like Mario Lopez, these headlines here were actually generated differently than these links here. So in traditional SEO, these links here are in the title tag, but for news results, they have a different algorithm. They're looking for the H1. They're looking for the headline that's on that page, and they'll actually ignore the title tag. So on the Celeb Buzz page, what we actually did was we threw the SEO title. I mean, they're not really practicing it, but we threw the SEO title into the title tag. This H2, this deck, was the longer descriptive thing. So it doesn't always appear on the page, right? They have the headline that appears everywhere on their page, where you have the context of the photo and you have context of the site that you're in. And that would show up in this place here. The headline would show up here next to the context of the photo. And then we would also have the SEO play where we had the right title tag. The cool thing for us was that what we noticed was if your headline, your H1, and your title tag were identical, Google will filter out your organic listing. They'll only list you in news. But because we had two different titles, one headline, one title, we're still appearing both places. So we actually incremented our organic search traffic by not necessarily manipulating the search engine, but really like we're taking advantage of the fact that they were deduping based on that item. And we're trying to both provide a great user experience on site as well as provide an SEO outlet for ourselves. And that's about it. One other thing that I'll kind of just touch upon. I know I'm going really long. If you guys ever do get into like Ajax, really heavy stuff like you're going Angular, Ember, all those kind of things, look at this deck because it'll at least help you point you in the right direction. One of the things, so this is the trend, right? So like, it's a tongue-in-cheek thing, but like Ajax is like violence. If it doesn't solve your problems, you're not using enough of it. And this is basically the trend. Everybody is going toward these JavaScript frameworks. And the reason being is that they realize that to have a very fast, clean user experience, all that code that normally would be rendered in the back end should be on the front end on the user's browser, right? So there are a lot of frameworks that people are pushing to, especially in the startup space. Almost everybody's going Angular. If you're not doing Angular, you're doing Ember. And if you follow this guy, Ilya Grigorik, he's a Google developer evangelist, something like that. But basically goes around, talks to people about how to speed up your website. And in the end, so in the beginning, we had, let's optimize for speed, make the thing as small as possible so when we send it over a wire, that it's super quick. Then we started thinking about performance. How do we actually increase the speed of JavaScript and whatnot? Because there's this idea of 100 milliseconds where a user's reaction time is about 100 milliseconds from when they see something. But now the new thinking is it's all about the perceived human perception of how smooth your site is, which is 16 milliseconds, which is essentially 60 frames per second. And what it comes down to is if you've ever been on a scrolling site and you see the jitter, that jitter is 16 milliseconds. If there is no jitter, that means it's quicker than 16 milliseconds, right? So that perception of smoothness is actually, it actually impacts your bottom line on how users perceive your site. So these are some of the frameworks, blah, blah, blah. So this is kind of what I wanted to get to. On Spin, we spent a few months to actually optimize for human perception, for speed, and for user experience. And we started for a couple months, and then after a few months, after we were done, basically about a month and a half later, we saw our crawl rate increase, 80%. This translated to an 80% increase in organic search for us. So we added another 600,000 unique visitors. And it kind of hockey sticks if you like shrink it this way a little bit. But essentially at some point, Google says, oh, we get it. We've crawled your entire site. And this is where like, your crawl rate matters, right? Because if you can get Google to completely crawl your site, they'll see like, oh, you holistically change your entire site to make it faster, to make it a better user experience. And we're seeing that in the search results. People are coming to your site. And what we were starting to see is users would consume more pages per visit. Users were bouncing less. And surprisingly, they weren't actually even spending more time. They're actually spending less time on our site, but they're consuming way more content. And they're coming back way more often because our site wasn't slow anymore. So especially when you look at your own analytics and your own metrics, time on site is a good barometer, but at the same time, you have to be careful with it, with any of your metrics, right? Because your time on site could be long. You're like, wow, it's like super great, but really your site is just super slow. And I mean, the rest of the stuff I don't necessarily need to get into because you guys, I just want to make another point, but basically, sorry, now I'm going fast, but we repeated the test on Celeb Buzz, and we saw the same thing. We quadrupled our crawl rate, and we added 1 million unique visitors to our site. Granted, we already had established trust and whatnot, but this is even harder when you have established trust. To be able to do strong incremental increases, and this is all largely due to two things. It's the speed of your site, and then we also started linking out to other high-quality websites. So one of the things that Google has deep down in its algorithm is this idea of hubs, right? So most SEOs and most thinking today is, I'm going to just hoard all the value I have. I'm not going to link out to anybody or my competitors because I don't want to give them an advantage. And part of this is that we kind of proved that incorrect. So deep down, like I said, there's this idea that, like when you think back to Yahoo directory days, right? The human curated directory was actually a great experience because I got to a place and it showed me where I really should be going next. And what we started ended up doing was we would have links to like Miley Cyrus, to Kim Kardashian, and to other stuff that we knew that, hey, we should be a quote unquote authority on, right? And we would link to our own tag pages, right? Here's all the things about Kim Kardashian when you click on this article, or here are all the things about Miley Cyrus. And what I told our editorial team to do is, hey, why don't we just instead link to Miley Cyrus's IMDb page, Wikipedia page, her tour page, anything that was relevant about her that wasn't on our site, that was high quality. And essentially what we ended up doing tactically was, I would just say, Mario Lopez, and our editorial team would pick one of the top 3 results and link to it based on the context that they had. And we saw users, well, you can't see that because, has that always been the case where I'm showing you a blank screen? That's weird. Anyhow, sorry. Well, you can't see it. We started seeing users who were actually coming back to our site even though they were leaving our site. That was one of the fears. If we send users away, they're going to lose their context and they're not going to come back and read more pages. That was actually the opposite. We actually saw them consume more of our pages and actually return more often because in the cases of like Kara, this whatever, I don't know who she is, right? And we're sending her to Wikipedia, IMDb. I'm like, oh, now I know who she is. You're actually an important site for me. Like I actually can discover new things about it without having to Google it again. And Google was seeing this. Google has this patent, and they also have a bunch of papers that talk about this. But basically, the patent goes, if a site sends users to other great user experiences, then that site should actually benefit in the search result, because now they're no longer coming back to Google and having to hunt and search. You're actually sending them to other great places. So if you think about yourself on Wikipedia or Snopes or any place that you get lost in, you're like a couple hours later, you're like, damn, I was supposed to be doing something else, right? Those are the kind of experiences that you want to give your users, and you'll see the benefit in SEO as well. So that's all I have. I can open it up for questions. Go ahead.
Can you talk about mobile app SEO?
Right, mobile app SEO. So it's super hard and not necessary. Like, you can do the keyword tags, and then you can do like meta descriptions, but in the end, it actually comes down to reviews and quantity of downloads that really drive the metric. The interesting thing nowadays, though, is that more and more users are actually discovering apps through traditional search. So when you're thinking about your description and what you're writing in that iTunes description or Android description, those things will actually come back into Google search. So when people are looking for it in Google, like the top 10 whatever, you actually might appear in those results, your iTunes listing, right? There are definitely things that you can do, like looking at competitive terms, but sometimes those terms don't stick. What I've really seen as far as mobile growth, mobile download growth, is not even SEO, right? A lot of the startups that I talk to and mentor, especially the ones in San Francisco, what they've been doing is, especially for the smaller startups, they actually do a pretty crappy user experience. They do that thing where they give you, you're on your mobile phone, you're trying to get to the site, and bam, download our app. You want to see the rest of the site? Download our app, right? And they won't let you close it out, right? Which is really annoying, but honestly, that drives way more downloads and way more engagement. And if you have actually a quality app, you'll see people are much happier having downloaded your app. And then what you can actually do is, after the user, either you can detect that the user's, I don't know how well you can do this, but like I think in Android you can detect whether the user has downloaded your app. iPhone too, iOS, like in certain cases, no.
You go to a website that has a mobile app, it'll tell you in the top
where it is, right?
You can either open it or install it.
Right. But in those cases, what you can do is you can actually cookie the user, or even if the users clicked on the thing, you can just cookie them. And the next time they come to your site, you can actually give them the mobile web experience. But what a lot of these startups are actually doing are they are waiting till they get to a critical mass. They force users to download their app until they get to a critical mass where they're actually getting great app store recommendations and reviews, where they don't need to force the users in anymore, and then they give them access to the mobile web experience. It's one tactic that seems to be working that drives way more traffic than, or way more downloads than anything you can do from like traditional app. I mean, like talking about like hundreds of thousands more downloads. Yeah. So, yeah.
Do you think it's worth doing focusing on SEO for enterprise?
For enterprise software, that's a good question.
Like most of the stuff, it's like you're trying to get massive number of page views for consumer stuff, right? It's like very consumer focused.
Right.
I just don't know if like SEO is even worth doing.
I mean, I would say the bare minimum, make sure like your titles and those kind of things are correct, but usually like that's a sales kind of a thing, right? Like especially with enterprise, right? You're talking about maybe a few thousand customers, right? And trade shows is where you're going to spend most of your time, stuff like that. Yeah. But I mean, there are competitive things where like so the other thing with the apps and even like enterprise SEO is that at that point, you shouldn't even think about your own site, right? You should not be doing SEO for your site. You should be doing SEO on other sites. And what I mean by that is I've seen people who have like apps, and what they'll do is like they'll go into Quora and they'll write a really great Quora reply, and they'll even link to their own app, and they'll get ranked up really high. And when someone searches that term, Quora is more likely to rank than you are, or Stack Overflow is more likely to rank than you are, or like The Verge or whatever, who's doing a roundup of the best whatever. Those users are more likely to convert into real users who are going to use your product than you trying to outrank those places. So that's where I'm not encouraging like comment spam, but if you can go into comments and actually be useful, right? Like comment spam is just like plain stupid, but if you do read some comments and you're like, whoa, that was a really insightful comment, you'll go look up that person. I know I do it. Maybe I'm like outside of the norm, but like people will go, who is this guy who has like a really good insight, right? And if that's the case, you might actually get more downloads that way, or you might actually expose yourself to like a publish, like I've seen this also where I've done this, where I've commented on an article, and a lot of the publications, the editorial team, or even the writer themselves, read those comments and they'll say, that was really cool. And they'll look you up. And then they'll say, I want to do a story, because they need another story lead. And then they'll do a whole piece on you, right? Or they'll cite you as a resource. And that is way more value than you can actually ever do by doing your own little SEO on your own little small little website.
What about if, like, we talked a little bit about link back, and what if, like, let's say, on a lot of sites we've had where it's almost like a white label thing, and they'll say powered by XYZ. Like, how much does that actually affect those?
So it used to have a lot of effect, like when you see like the WordPress theme, like, designed by blah, blah, blah. And to some extent, it still has an effect. In it's much smaller space, but what you can think of is, even like when I think about widgets, right? Like Edmunds, we provide like widgets to other companies. And it's not necessarily getting the link back. It's just, what Google's looking for is, are you popular, are you distributed across the web, right? So they'll see it, they'll see in the code that, hey, Edmunds like widget is embedded on all these sites. Or your widget or your thing that's powered by, it's embedded on all these sites. Even if it's not even a clear link, right? Even if it's just your brand name, they'll make those attributions back. They do it in press releases, and press releases got hammered recently. But essentially what people were doing, or like what Google knows, is that just that word alone, if it's unique, is a citation back to your brand, right? And those kind of things can be powerful, especially if you think about, if you actually are going to do like quote unquote link building, the thing you need to think about is, how do I get on multiple domains as opposed to how do I get more links from the same domain, right? Because what Google's looking for is, are a lot of people talking about you? Are you relevant to a large mass of people, not to just this one website? This one website could send you millions and millions of links, and it can work at brute force. At some point, you're going to get like I said, Google's a statistical machine, right? So at some point, there's a threshold where if you have more than so many links, you should be actually a valuable website, right? And there's plenty of cases where you can actually see this, but that diversity is harder to gain, right? And that's where they're putting a lot of their value.
Kind of a follow-on to his question. I had read something about like implied backlinks. So even like let's say, it's the Wall Street Journal or something, and they don't actually link to you,
Yeah.
they mention you
Right.
by your unique brand name,
Right.
like Pepsi or whatever.
Right.
And it's implied link.
Yes.
Are they doing that?
They
to
are.
your knowledge?
So it's harder to demonstrate in search, but basically you can see this where, like even where I talked about the PR thing, where someone's like, I'm saying like, you should seed people with certain words. Even if they're not using those words to link to you, Google's seeing those words in context. And if they see it often enough across the web, they'll associate those words to your site. So initially, this is how it started. If you heard of Google bombing, essentially, if you search back in the day for miserable failure, George W. Bush's page on whitehouse.gov would appear #1 for that term. And in no place were they putting the word miserable failure on the whitehouse.gov site, right? But basically, everybody was using anchor text links. These links, the words that were in the link, all said miserable failure, and everybody knew how Google kind of worked. It's this idea of these words pass value over to this page, because there's a lot of cases where, like, the California DMV for the longest time was robots.txt their whole site, meaning they were not allowing Google to crawl. And Google was coming in like, okay, well, you're not letting us see what's on the page. We don't know what title to give this page, but we know that people search for the DMV all day long and they want to get to you. So we need to come up with something. So they actually used the anchor text that they saw across the web, and they used that as the link instead of HTTP, dmv.gov or CA, whatever it is. And they were starting to use those phrases. That algorithm is like super old. That's like 2004, 2005. Since then, they've they have that context where they know these other phrases that are kind of clustered together. And even with the newest algorithm, Hummingbird, they're now expanding this idea of topical maps. So it's no longer just the keyword phrase itself. They're looking at what phrases are in this topic. And you'll see this, like when you search for, gosh, I don't know why I can't get back to, let me see if I just do this. If you search for,
Semantic search at the
it's kind of like semantic search, right?
for semantic search.
It's almost kind of like synonym search, but at the same time, like they're tying concepts together, right? So, and the reason why is that the future of search is largely around this idea of like they want to push for voice search,
Like natural language search.
natural language search. So, let's see if we can do this. Come on. Okay, Google. Oh, it's already doing it. Barack Obama. I'm totally failing right now. Barack Obama.
According to Wikipedia, Barack Hussein Obama II is the 44th and current President of the United States and the first African American to hold the office.
How old is he?
He is 52 years old.
Who is his wife?
Barack Obama's spouse is Michelle Obama since 1992.
So the idea here is, if you were to categorize this by search terms, who is his wife would not rank for anything, and especially not Michelle Obama, right? So they're trying to do this topical map, and they believe that voice search is the next coming of like the search revolution. They've been pushing this a lot.
Are you currently optimizing for natural language queries, which is basically to say including stuff like instead of just like best car seats. Like,
Right.
what is the best car seat for me? Like, are you optimizing against
No.
natural language phrases?
The thing is, I'm just basically, my way of optimizing for natural language search is just writing a really good article that people will actually understand and putting a headline that people will actually understand, right? And Google will figure that out. Because if you asked me 4 or 5 years ago, I'd be like, yes, you need to do it this way. Now, like I at this point defer to Google because they are actually doing leaps and bounds more than they were doing in the past. I mean,
Put the sort of that natural language query, like, what is the best story
Right.
for me, into our titles.
right.
So we're getting these very long URLs.
And that's where, honestly, you don't have to do that anymore.
Okay.
I mean, that would be like a 2007, 2008 type of tactic that would work really well. And honestly, it was,
No one was talking to their phones in 07, so you don't get all.
well, you would see people search for that way too, right? Like you would search like what is, and then it would key on those words, but Google was not actually saying that's a question, right? They were just like trying to key on those words. And essentially that's what you're doing, right? But nowadays, like they understand topically what things are about. And also, I mean, it's still like, granted, I say like they understand it, but it's still very rudimentary, right? They're starting off with linked data. They're starting off with facts. And if you really were like a person to game things, you would go into Freebase. Freebase is where like, that's their Wikipedia, right? And that's where they collect a lot of this data, and that's where they tag a lot of this data. If you can figure out how to use Freebase, that's the trick, because Freebase is super hard to use. But essentially, if like that's where they're starting with factual data, right? And that's why they want to push people to do schema, right? And then they're applying that deep learning to figure out, what are these phrases mean, how they work natural language. I would say what you're doing is like probably can get you traffic in the short term, even in the next year, but the thing is, I think it's dying pretty quickly. Yeah. So I would say optimize for the user experience at the point. I would more optimize for what makes more sense in Facebook and Twitter, and what are those titles, right? Because what is going to grab that user so that they can share it more so than optimizing for that what is question.
Open graph tags for that stuff.
You can use that for open graph tags. Yeah, you can change the open graph tags accordingly.
So it works, so it's clean on social.
Right. But I mean, like in search, like I haven't seen it to be like, wow, this is like a huge game changer by putting these additional terms in, or by putting those terms in.
Trying to make it more natural.
Right. Yeah. Unless you're really seeing a user experience where like people are like, oh, that's exactly what. I mean, there is a piece of it where if you have a term that is identical to what the users search for, you'll see way more engagement. So one of the things, and one of the reasons why demand media was so great at the time was Google's was largely broken. If you search for, one of the examples I always give is that you search for crawfish, right? We all know what crawfish are. You're in Louisiana, crawfish. You're in the Northwest, it's actually crawdaddies. And back in the day when you search for Google, you search for like crawdaddies and you're in Northwest, you would not get the crawfish article. Google sucked, right? Nowadays they get it, right? They'll say, oh, you're looking for crawfish. We'll serve you crawfish even though you put in crawdaddies and you get a recipe. But the thing is, you'll notice that user experience-wise, if you have an article about crawdaddies, that person in the Northwest is more likely to trust and read and share that article than they are to the word crawfish, right? So there is a little bit of a trade-off. And Google will eventually see that over time if they can machine learn to that, depending on what vertical they're looking at. But at the same time, this is where like stuff where actually we'll do things like look at just what is the most popular, right, and go for that, and then potentially in the beginning of the intro, like, oh, this is also known as crawdaddies, and like kind of doing a little bit of the SEO play there, but it's more for the user experience where like I can anchor them on that term, like, hey, we speak your speak as well, and we're not just doing this for SEO purposes.
A lot of the examples you gave were from your past experiences working with publishing and media companies. How, if at all, would your approach and execution for SEO change for a different model?
Like products, right? So this is one of the interesting things that we're covering right now on Edmunds. So on Edmunds, our product is cars, right? And we not only help you figure out what cars you should buy, but we actually help you find the exact car that you might want to buy, right? So if I go to special offers, my internet's a little slow. Maybe I can find this a bit different way. I'm just new to Edmunds, so oh, golly gee. Here we go. Okay, so for us, and this is like a lot of e-commerce where there's a lot of 2015 Nissan Versas across the web. And each of these are actually unique pages because each of these are unique VINs. That means it actually is a physically different product, even though it's exactly identical, right? So what we're actually actively doing is we're coming up with a canonicalization strategy. And this is where these products, like a customer or a car life cycle is, it's on the lot roughly about 30 days, and then it's sold, right? So our problem is these pages exist, and then they disappear after 30 days. And Google doesn't have enough time to like really like build up value. And even if they did build up value, when the user gets there, like the page is a 404, right? And you're like, that sucks. So what we're actually doing is, from an SEO tactical standpoint, is this page, as long as the car exists on the lot and is not sold, it stays on the site and it canonicalizes it to itself. So meaning any new links coming in, we're like, this is the canonical place for it to go. Now, once the car is sold, it's no longer useful to the user, and that's why we've been removing it. But what we're planning on doing is actually leaving it up on the site. We're going to leave it up on the site for 30 days. We're going to change the graphic and say, this car is sold, and then actually change the interface so it says, here are other cars that are exactly like this or near like this that you might want to look for. So it's providing a better user experience. But after that point of sale, what we do is on the back end, in that canonical tag, we now say, hey, this URL is no longer here. It's at a different location. And we're essentially telling Google that all the value that you've given this, put into another place. It might be an identical 2015 Versa. It could be up one level, meaning like it could be a listing of all the Versas on that dealer's lot, or it could be just any Versa near you. The caveat here is that when you do this, Google is going to start doing a diff. They're going to start saying, okay, you're telling me that this page no longer exists. It's now over here. And if this page is not identical to the other page that you're talking to, Google's going to say, I'm not going to give you all the value. I might pass you some value, but I'm not going to give you all the value. But it's better than no value, right? So this is where it comes back to URLs are forever, right? So we did a lot of testing at demand, and when we got hit by Google Panda, we lost a lot of traffic. And one way that we had to recover our traffic is we had to get rid of a lot of these duplicate articles. So these articles that were crawdadding crawfish. And we even took it to an extreme where we had 10 articles about how to grill crawfish, and 10 articles about how to grill the crawdaddies, and 10 articles how to boil crawfish, and 10 articles on how to skewer crawdaddies. Like, we had insane amount of near duplicate content, all completely unique. So we had to start consolidating everything. And what we did when we started consolidating everything is we learned a few things. Is that the URL holds a lot of the value. So we did a couple tests. So we had a URL that had a lot of value, and we needed to get rid of a lot of these other pages. So we would 301 redirect one way or the other way. And what we discovered was, if we take a page, like this page, and we copy it line by line for all the code, all the content, and put it on a new URL, and then we 301 redirect over here, which is the proper way of telling Google, pass the value to this new place, right? So old A, new B, 301 redirect, pass the value. What actually happens is you lose 17% of your organic traffic, just like that, gone. We don't necessarily know why, but there's something in this logic, and Google keeps on saying like, oh yeah, you should be fine over time. No, like you'll lose 17% of your traffic, at least from our publisher standpoint at scale, right? And that's pretty bad, right? Then what we started doing is, okay, well, if I redirect to, like that's if I have like redirect same article to same article. Now, if I redirect from an article to a similar article, I'm actually losing even more, because Google's like, oh, they're not the same. So you're going to lose like something like 20-25% of your traffic. And then if you redirect to like a category level, like say this is about cars for sale, and I redirect it up to AutoNation Nissan South Bay, I'll probably lose something like 50 to 60% of my value. And then if I redirect this to the homepage, I'll see a little bit of traffic go across, and over time it'll go to zero. Because at some point Google's like, it's not even similar. You're not even sending a person to the similar experience. But what was interesting is, if we took an article, and that wasn't necessarily like, so I've got URL A, old, great URL, and URL B, which has been around for a little bit, but not so great. But we think that the content here is actually better than the content that is on the original high-ranking article, and we swap it in, you only lose about 7 to 10% of your traffic. You lose less. It's because all the value is tied up into that URL. And it might have changed in the last 2-3 years since we've done that test, but we did that at scale. We did that across hundreds of thousands of URLs, right, for each of the tests that we were doing, because we had to take down 2 million articles, right? So
So you're moving that entire content over
to the clean URL, right? Okay. So that's where URLs have a lot of power. The other thing you should know is that I want to share with you, especially, I know you guys aren't at this point, but if you search for Home Advisor, Merchant Circle, no, Service Magic, sorry. I know this is a really long query, so I'll send this to Robert, but there's a case study here. And this is where what you read about SEO is not always the best thing to follow, even though Google and everybody else says you should follow it. So if you're familiar with the local space, Service Magic was this huge beast of a business, and they were ranking for a lot of things. The thing is, they noticed that people really didn't understand Service Magic or even understand what that brand was, and they weren't able to tie the two things together. So they said, we're going to rebrand, we're going to be Home Advisor. This makes more sense to our users, and this is something that we need to do. And if you read this case study, they basically, I'll just highlight the section, but they did the standard thing that Google tells you to do. Redirect, 301 redirect from your old site to the new site. And overnight, they lost 30 to 50% of their organic search traffic, right? And later on, they said, okay, yeah, over 5 months, they now have 90% of their search traffic back. And Google tells you this, that like, in the long term, you'll get your search traffic back. The thing is that they don't tell you is that you're going to have to wait 5 to 6 months before that comes back, which for most businesses, that means you got to lay off a ton of people, right? Especially if you're reliant on that traffic. This is where you can actually do it in a smarter way. And this is where canonicals play. And this is where like that thing that I was showing on the VIN. If you ever need to move a URL or even move your whole site, what you should do is you should use the canonical to do that. Canonical is a soft 301 redirect, which means it takes time for Google to pick it up because they need to crawl your site, and that's where your crawl rate matters. They need to see it a few times, then they need to ingest it, and then they need to figure out how to consolidate all this stuff back. But what I typically will do is, if I need to move a whole section of my site to a new URL, I'll set up both URLs. Both will render to the user, meaning like URL A, URL B, this is the new URL that I like, but the content is identical. Users can get to both of them at the same place. And then I set the canonical on this old URL to point to the new URL, right? And then over time, what I do is I watch my analytics, and I look for organic search to reduce on this site and organic traffic to pick up over here. And so what's happening is Google's updating their index, updating their search results, but that takes 5 to 6 months, especially at a larger site. But at that time, you're not losing any of this traffic, and you're also migrating it over here. So you're losing nothing at all. And then once your traffic over here is down to like 5 or 10%, then you do the 301 redirect. And if you lose that 5 to 10%, no big deal. If you retain like 90% of that, 9% of your traffic over the 6 months, that's perfectly fine, right? And that's an acceptable loss at that point. So this is one of those things where people actually don't talk about this. Like, I do this, and a couple of the people that I hang out in the back channel circles, we do that, right? But everybody else follows the basic things that Google tells you, because what you should know about the Google Webmaster Tools team and all those things, the videos and everything that they put out, they're great resources and they're awesome and you should listen to them. But the thing is, they're meant for mom and pop sites. They're meant for small little sites who have no real developers who will shoot themselves in the foot by 404ing their whole site. They're not people who are actually building scalable or sustainable businesses. They're restaurants and stuff like that. And that's the large majority of the web, right? And that's who they're talking to. So when you're thinking about actually building out a scaled site, those kind of things you need to take. You need to just be wary about who the audience that they're trying to reach and whether that applies to you or not.